How's it sound? Good. Here in California, we have a Good Samaritan law. The federal government also has a law referred to as a Good Samaritan law, as does every single state. The basics of a Good Samaritan law is legal protections from civil suits for a person who stops to help someone in need. The understanding of the term Good Samaritan is so ubiquitous that the phrase protections for Good Samaritans is all that's needed for people to understand the concept. Like most people, I had heard the biblical story of the Good Samaritan many times in childhood. A traveler is robbed and beaten and left to die on the road, and two people pass him by before a man stops to help him. I didn't understand that the term Samaritan wasn't actually a word meaning something like citizen or community member. So to me, a good Samaritan was a good member of the community, which is how it's usually used in day-to-day use. When a passerby stops to help change a tire, he might be referred to as a good Samaritan. Mall walkers who rush to lift a gate off of a storekeeper are good Samaritans. We understand a good Samaritan to be any person who bothers to do the decent thing and help someone in need. But that misses what a Samaritan actually was in Jesus's story. What messed me up was that I had heard the tale as a children's story. While I had actually read the story in the Bible once or twice, I never really read it as anything but a children's story. Children's stories are simple. The idea is usually to get across a single message. In this case, the message that a decent person stops to help those in need. But this is a parable told by Jesus. And while many of the Old Testament parables are, in fact, children's stories with one strong point, Jesus's parables tend to be complicated. And it's important to take note of the context of the story. He usually tells his stories for a specific reason. And you need to understand how examples and events in the story were viewed at the time, because as a rule, every detail counts. I'm going to pause here and read Luke 10:25 through 37 in the King James Version, because that's probably the version most of us heard as kids, and I kind of like it. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answering said, Thou shalt love thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. Do this, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance, there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the host and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? And he said, he that showed mercy on him. And Jesus said unto him, go and do thou likewise. So, context. There's a lot to unpack here. So much information that's not spoken because all hearing already knew it. They would know that the lawyer is not a lawyer who might assist in a trial, but rather a scholar who studied the Torah and its interpretation. The Torah being not just a religious book at the time, but the actual law. Another thing definitely known by Jesus, most of his followers, and almost surely the scholar, was that at this point, Jesus had already started telling people that the way to heaven was not by good deeds, but through him. So this test, this temptation of Jesus's knowledge of the law was somewhat an attempt at tricking him. Maybe challenging him would be a better word, to speak in direct conflict with Jewish holy law. Jesus declines the bait and instead asks the man to state the law, which he does. And Jesus says, okay, then, there you have it, kind of. But the man doesn't stop there. Looking to justify his challenge, he asks Jesus just who is considered his neighbor. A much more complicated question than it looks. The Hebrew word used in the Torah for neighbor in the phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, reah, has a fairly narrow meaning. It mostly just means people who live in close proximity to you. But it's generally accepted in this context to include all fellow Israelites. The Hebrew words krov or amit could also translate into neighbor, but would have a much more broad meaning that would include friends, companions, family, and, well, kind of anybody one might want to call a neighbor. But these words aren't used in the Torah in this command. They use the word reah, intentionally limiting the scope of who is us. The Targums, Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible that existed in oral tradition during Jesus's time and were later written down, would be the only rendition of the law that would be known by the uneducated masses who did not read Hebrew. They came about rather organically, and the religious elite and the scholars had virtually no control over them. The Targums use the word chaver to translate the word neighbor in this phrase. It has a much broader meaning, including friends, companions, and is readily stretched to cover all humans. There is an Aramaic word, gribah, that would translate closer to the idea of people living near you. But the Targums didn't use it. They chose the word chaver. It would indicate that there was already a bit of a cultural shift in the population as a whole to the idea that God wanted them to love all people as they would themselves. By this point in time, Jesus most likely was already receiving threats from the religious authorities for teaching ideas in conflict with the written law. In this case, he is aiding, abetting, and downright encouraging a change in attitude that's already shifting away from the established point of view. Asking Jesus who his neighbor was also a bit of a challenge to see if Jesus will stick to the strict interpretation of the law or stretch out the concept of neighbor to include everyone, as Jesus was kind of prone to do in his teachings in general. So when the legal scholar asks him to say who would be a neighbor, Jesus answers by telling him a story, into which he stuffed a surprising amount of teaching in one paragraph. First off, Jesus tells us that the man who is robbed is not an outlaw or a beggar. How do we know that? Because they took his clothes. Up until modern times, cloth in general was valuable and expensive. The man had clothes that were new enough and good enough quality to bother to rob him for, robbery being an inherently risky occupation. Also, anyone listening would probably be familiar with the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, which was a fairly well-traveled road, and for the most part, anyone traveling on that road was going somewhere. They would also know that the priest and the Levite would both be from the clan Levi, the priest being of higher ranking, but both engaged in religious practice. The clan of Levi were tasked with the disposition of religious interaction between God and the people. They would be considered the good people of high rank. And like today, their status as religious leaders would confer both an assumption of goodness and an expectation of being more moral than the average smug. In addition, everyone who heard Jesus speak, would know what a Samaritan was, or more correctly, who a Samaritan was. While the term Good Samaritan is never used in the Bible, if a person of that time happened to use the term Good Samaritan, it would probably be said in the same tone as someone from the Old West might say, he's a good Indian. Or someone in the Old South might say, she's a good colored woman. The Samaritans and the Jews, while having shared ancestry and the same religious beliefs, didn't get along very well. Both cultures considering the other to be kind of lowlifes. Well, they were not at war, and a Samaritan wasn't actually an enemy. In general, the Jews would assume that a Samaritan was lazy and dirty, with questionable ethics and even more questionable moral character. If Jesus were to tell the tale in modern times, he might have said a pimp or an illegal immigrant stopped to help. Given the animosity between the groups, the Samaritan would not have been a local, rather a traveler, probably a trader who traveled that road regularly, as evidenced by his telling the innkeeper that he'd pay if needed on return, indicated he is known to and trusted by the innkeeper, and by his trust of the innkeeper shown by handing him what people would know was a respectable sum to care for the wounded man. If the tale was told to people not contemporary to Judea at the time, and Jesus wanted them to understand the meanings, it might sound like this. A man of some standing, not a beggar or other person that good folk might avoid, is traveling a well-traveled road between two large cities when thieves happen upon him. He is robbed of his clothes and beaten and left by the side of the road. A priest of some power and standing in the community and with a moral obligation to follow the commands of God, walking along the road saw him. Because the man has been beaten and left naked, the priest took him for an unsavory character. Not wanting to be challenged by any moral expectations of helping him, he crosses to the other side of the road so as not to need to face him. Another man of somewhat less status, but also a religious man with a moral obligation, soon comes along the road, and likewise crosses to the other side so as not to need to confront a person in obvious need. Next comes along an outsider, a trader with modest means and very low status, generally considered to be unsavory. He sees the injured man and stops to help him. He spends time and supplies to tend his wounds. He puts the man on the donkey he's riding and, walking himself, takes him to an inn. After spending the night caring for him, he leaves in a respectable sum of money with an innkeeper whom he knows, with the request that the man be cared for, and then promises to pay any additional monies required, should more be needed, when he returns. Now, Jesus, stretching the concept of neighbor to cover a Samaritan, would be a scandal that was just what the scholar was looking for. But Jesus doesn't do this. Instead, he forces the scholar, now backed into a corner by the tail, to concede that the lowlife outsider, not Israelite Samaritan, was a neighbor to the man beset by robbers, more of a neighbor than the respectable Israelites that turned their face from him. The man himself, a legal expert who studies, interprets, and advises on the word of the Torah, stretched the word out to cover more than was intended in the original text of the law. He himself labeled the Samaritan a neighbor. And he did this in the context of answering his own question in direct reference to the command in the Torah of just who is his neighbor that God commands him to love as himself. Jesus seems always happy to slip in little lessons about who we should be as humans anytime he decides to tell a tale. But he always has a main point. And we know what the point is because he tells us. In this case, he tells the tale in answer to the legal scholars questioning who God intends for us to love as ourselves. And the answer is everyone. And if we are ever not sure who our neighbor is, then we should not be looking out to find the answer, but in. The issue isn't who is a neighbor to me, but rather who am I a neighbor to? The last thing that Jesus tells his challenger is to go act like the neighbor he just labeled the Samaritan to be. He's not just saying here that we should help a stranger in need, although he is saying that quite loudly, or that we shouldn't judge people by their clothes or lack thereof, or by their status, because priests are humans and some of them are dweebs, another point he makes abundantly clear. But the thing he is saying loudest, the point of the story, is that we should generally walk through life with an attitude of caring for humanity as a whole. The command under discussion is not help a stranger in need, but rather love thy neighbor as thyself. And your neighbor is any other human you might encounter. Blessed be. And now if we can have a couple of ushers, we will collect offerings. Hi, James.